I signed my name because it was the responsible thing to do, and for years, that decision cost me quietly. Nothing dramatic happened at first, just fewer emails, shorter meetings. My desk moved closer to the copy room. Then one Tuesday at 6:42 a.m., my work badge stopped opening the side door I'd used every morning for 5 years. The security guard apologized and handed it back like it was broken. I smiled, took the stairs, and still believed I understood my place right before everything I trusted began to collapse. I signed the document on a Wednesday afternoon in March, sitting in my car with the engine still running because parking downtown cost $4 every 15 minutes. The pen slipped slightly in my hand. I remember that detail because I had to go over the last letter of my last name twice to make it legible. I told myself it was the responsible thing to do. That's what everyone kept saying. Responsible, mature, necessary. I was 36 years old, living in a 2-bedroom townhouse outside Des Moines, Iowa. Not the kind of place people imagine when they think of ambition, but the kind of place you choose when you want predictability. I had a steady job as a compliance analyst for a regional insurance firm. I paid my mortgage on time. I brought lunch from home 3 days a week. I did not take risks. The document I signed that day wasn't dramatic. No raised voices, no ultimatums, just 12 pages of dense language and a final paragraph that said I was voluntarily stepping aside from a role I had helped build in order to support organizational stability. The person across from me thanked me. He shook my hand. He said, "This will really help everyone." I believed him. At the time, it didn't feel like a loss. It felt like a trade. I gave up visibility. In return, I kept my job, my health insurance, my reputation as someone who was easy to work with. There was a cost, but it seemed manageable. For the first few months, nothing really changed. I still drove the same route to the office, turning left at the Casey's gas station, passing the high school football field with its faded banners, parking in the same unassigned spot near the loading dock. I still badged in at 8:17 a.m. Most mornings, coffee in my right hand, laptop bag on my left shoulder. My desk was still mine. The small framed photo of my sister's kids was still there. The fake plant I'd bought at Target because real ones kept dying under fluorescent lights still leaned slightly to the left. People still nodded when they passed me in the hallway. That's the thing about decisions like this. They don't announce their consequences all at once. The first sign was an email I didn't receive. It was about a project I'd worked on for nearly a year, a regulatory overhaul that had required weekend calls and spreadsheets so wide they didn't fit on my monitor. I found out the meeting had happened because someone forwarded me the calendar invite afterward, asking if I had any thoughts. I told myself it was an oversight. The second sign was when my name stopped appearing in meeting notes. Not removed, just absent. Decisions were documented as if they'd emerged fully formed, without discussion. Then my manager asked if I could move desks. "Just temporarily," he said. They needed my space for someone who required more frequent collaboration. It's not reman. My new desk was closer to the printers. It hummed constantly. The chair wobbled if I leaned too far back. I didn't complain. I had chosen this. That's what I kept reminding myself. Outside of work, my life looked fine. I went to the grocery store on Sundays. I watched reruns of cooking shows while folding laundry. I called my mother once a week and told her everything was going well, because that's what daughters like me do. We smooth things over. We don't create worry. Sometimes, late at night, I would open my laptop and reread the document I'd signed, scrolling slowly, line by line, as if there might be a sentence I'd missed that explained when things would rebalance. When my sacrifice would be acknowledged. It never did. By summer, people had stopped asking my opinion altogether. They still asked for data, still forwarded tasks, but the conversations happened elsewhere, behind closed doors, over lunches I wasn't invited to. I noticed small things, the way my manager avoided eye contact when promotions were announced, the way newer hires spoke to me like I was a resource, not a peer, the way my calendar slowly emptied out. None of it was aggressive. That almost made it worse. In August, I realized my access had changed. I tried to open a shared drive I'd used for years and got a message that said, "Request permission." I assumed it was a system error. IT was always changing something. I submitted a ticket. 2 days later, I got a response that said my role no longer required that level of access. I stared at the screen for a long time before closing the tab. Still, I stayed. Because leaving would mean admitting the trade had been a mistake. And I wasn't ready to do that yet. The morning everything shifted. I woke up earlier than usual. 5:30 a.m. The house was quiet. The air smelled like rain that hadn't fallen yet. I put on the same gray blazer I always wore on Mondays, the one with the loose thread on the left cuff. I made coffee and drank it, standing up, scrolling through headlines without really reading them. At 6:42 a.m., I pulled into the employee lot and grabbed my badge from the cup holder. The side entrance was my habit. I'd used it every morning for 5 years because it was closer to the stairs and less crowded. I tapped my badge once. Nothing. I tried again. The light stayed red. I checked the back of the badge, rubbed it against my sleeve like static might help, and tried a third time. Still nothing. Behind the glass, the security guard looked up. He was new, young, probably didn't know me. He opened the door manually and asked to see my badge. I handed it to him without saying anything. He frowned at the screen on his desk, typed something, then looked back at me with an apologetic smile. "I'm sorry," he said. "This one doesn't have access here anymore. Give many jod, Arvand." He said it casually, like he was explaining a policy about visitor parking. I asked if there had been a mistake. He shook his head. "No, ma'am. You can still get in through the main entrance." He handed the badge back like it was defective. I thanked him. I meant it. He hadn't done anything wrong. As I walked around the building toward the front doors, I noticed something small and strange. The flagpole out front was missing its rope. The flag hung limp against the metal, unmoving. I don't know why that detail stuck with me. It just did. Inside, no one mentioned the access change. Not my manager. Not HR. Not anyone. I sat at my desk, logged in, and worked through my task list like always. Answered emails, updated a report, ate my lunch at 12:04 p.m., sharp. But something had shifted. Not in the office. In me. For the first time, the thought surfaced, fully formed, and impossible to ignore. I hadn't stepped aside to help everyone. I had stepped aside to make myself easier to remove. And the worst part wasn't the badge or the desk or the silence. It was the realization that every rule I'd followed, every compromise I'd made, every time I'd chosen peace over clarity, had led me exactly here. I still believed I understood my place. I still believed fairness would assert itself eventually. I just didn't know yet how wrong I was or how much of what I thought was solid was already starting to give way. After the badge incident, I told myself not to overreact. That was my instinct in most situations, to shrink the moment down until it fit neatly into something manageable. A technical issue, a policy update, a misunderstanding that would resolve itself if I just kept my head down and did my work. That's what responsible people did. I didn't bring it up to my manager. I didn't email HR. I didn't even mention it to the woman who sat 2 desks away from me and had once borrowed my charger so often she'd started calling it ours. I acted like nothing had changed. From the outside, my life still looked orderly. I woke up early. I showed up on time. I met deadlines. My performance reviews remained polite and vague, full of phrases like dependable and steady contributor. No one accused me of doing anything wrong. No one praised me for doing anything right. I existed in a narrow, quiet lane that didn't attract attention. At home, the routines continued. I watered the lawn on a strict schedule because the HOA sent warnings if you didn't. I meal prepped on Sundays, lining up plastic containers of grilled chicken and roasted vegetables like proof of discipline. I went to my sister's house every other Friday for dinner and listened to her complain about her kids' soccer schedules while I nodded and smiled. When she asked how work was going, I said, "Busy," which was technically true. What I didn't say was that my role had slowly become smaller in ways that were hard to describe out loud. That I was still doing the work, but no longer shaping it. That decisions were being made around me, not with me. I didn't say any of that, because saying it would mean acknowledging something else, that the document I'd signed hadn't preserved my position. It had quietly redefined it. I thought about that afternoon more often than I wanted to admit. The March sunlight slanting through the windshield, the hum of traffic outside the parking garage. The way the man across from me had smiled when I handed the papers back. This will really help everyone. At the time, I'd taken that to mean the company, the team, the broader good. Now, I wasn't so sure. The first time I felt the ground shift beneath me was during a quarterly review meeting in early September. I hadn't been invited, which in itself wasn't unusual anymore, but later that afternoon, a colleague stopped by my desk and asked if I could walk her through a new compliance framework that had been presented in the meeting. She seemed confused, a little overwhelmed. As I listened to her describe the framework, something tightened in my chest. It was my work. Not copied exactly, but unmistakably derived from the model I'd built the previous year. The same logic, the same sequencing, even the same terminology I'd invented because the official language hadn't quite fit. My name wasn't anywhere in the documentation. I asked who had presented it. She hesitated, then said my manager's name. "Oh," I said. "Okay." She thanked me and left, clearly relieved to have clarity. I sat there for a long time after that, staring at my screen without seeing it. I wasn't angry, not yet. I felt something colder than anger. A slow, creeping recognition. This wasn't about collaboration. This wasn't about efficiency. This was about erasure. Over the next few weeks, the pattern became harder to ignore. I was removed from a recurring meeting to streamline attendance. A junior analyst was assigned as the point person for a project I'd originated. My requests for updated information were met with delays that stretched into weeks. Still, no one said anything explicitly unkind. If anything, they were overly polite. Smiles in the hallway. Quick check-ins that never went anywhere. It was like being slowly edged out of a photograph, still technically present, but no longer central to the image. One evening in October, I stayed late to finish a report. The office was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes every sound feel amplified. The printers clicked and whirred. The cleaning crew moved methodically down the hall, their carts squeaking softly. I logged into the system to upload my final files and noticed something odd. A folder had been created under my name. Not by me. I clicked on it. Inside were drafts of documents I didn't recognize, labeled with project names I'd never been assigned. Some were incomplete. Some were clearly works in progress. All of them were time-stamped during hours I hadn't been working. At first, I assumed it was a mistake. A misfiled directory. Someone using my credentials by accident. Then I noticed the access logs. The files had been opened multiple times by people in management. My stomach dropped. I closed the folder without touching anything else and logged out. I didn't upload my report. I didn't send an email. I packed up my bag and left without saying goodbye to anyone. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying the same questions over and over. Why my name? Why now? Why create something that looked like my work but wasn't? By morning, I'd convinced myself I was imagining things. That exhaustion was making me paranoid, that if there were a real problem, someone would say something. I drove to work under a low, gray sky that threatened snow even though it was too early in the season. At the main entrance, I paused before tapping my badge, a small hesitation I hadn't noticed myself developing. The light turned green. Inside, everything looked the same. That day passed without incident. And so did the next. The folder remained untouched, sitting there like a question no one wanted to answer. I didn't tell anyone about it. Not my sister. Not the coworker I occasionally grabbed coffee with. Not even my mother, who had a way of turning every concern into a lecture about being grateful. I kept it to myself because I was still operating under the same belief I'd always had that if I followed the rules, things would work out in the end. That belief had guided most of my life. I'd followed the rules in school. I'd followed the rules in my career. I'd followed the unspoken rules in my family about not making waves, about not asking for more than what was offered. And now, the rules were being used against me. The realization didn't hit all at once. It seeped in slowly, like cold through a poorly insulated window. The company wasn't just moving on without me. It was preparing to move forward as if I'd never been there at all. I thought again about the phrase in the document I'd signed. Organizational stability. At the time, I'd imagined stability as something solid, secure, protective. Now, I understood what it really meant. It meant removing variables. It meant smoothing out edges. It meant eliminating people who might complicate the story later. I was no longer a contributor. I was a liability being quietly managed. One afternoon, as I was packing up to leave, I overheard my manager speaking to someone near the conference room. I wasn't trying to listen. I was just close enough to hear my name. "She handled it well," he said. "Didn't make a fuss." There was a pause. "That's why this works." I walked to my car with my keys clenched so tightly in my hand that my knuckles ached. That night, sitting alone at my kitchen table, I opened my laptop and stared at the screen without turning it on. For the first time, I allowed myself to think the thought I'd been avoiding since March. Maybe the decision I'd signed wasn't the beginning of stability. Maybe it was the beginning of something being done to me slowly, carefully, and with just enough courtesy that no one would question it. I still didn't know how far it would go. But I could feel it now, unmistakably. Whatever was happening wasn't an accident. After that comment in the hallway, I started paying attention in a different way. Not the anxious kind of attention that looks for confirmation of fear, but a quieter, more deliberate one. The kind you develop when you realize you're already inside a situation, whether you want to be or not, and the only real choice left is whether you understand it. I stopped filling the silence with explanations on their behalf. I stopped telling myself that management was busy, that processes were changing, that I was reading too much into things. Instead, I began to notice what actually happened, minute by minute, without interpreting it. On Monday morning, my manager stopped by my desk and asked if I could hold off on submitting a compliance memo I'd been working on. No reason given, just a light tone and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. On Tuesday, a junior analyst asked me how to respond to a regulator's inquiry, one that had come directly to her inbox, even though my role technically still covered that jurisdiction. On Wednesday, I received a calendar invite for a meeting labeled Knowledge Transfer. It wasn't addressed to me. I was included as an optional attendee. I declined. That felt new. Small, but new. The meeting went on without me, and no one followed up. By the end of the week, my inbox had grown noticeably quieter. I could go hours without receiving a single message. When emails did come in, they were transactional, requests without context, tasks without ownership. At first, the emptiness was unsettling. Then it became familiar. I started leaving work earlier, not because my workload had lightened, but because there was no reason to stay, no conversations to be part of, no decisions to weigh in on. The office lights flicked off automatically at 7 p.m. every night. More than once, I realized I was the only one left in my section long before that. One Thursday evening, as I packed up my laptop, I noticed a sticky note on my monitor. It wasn't addressed to me. No name. Just a single line written in block letters. "Do not delete final version." It was stuck to the corner of a document I hadn't created. I peeled the note off and opened the file. It was a draft of a compliance response that bore my writing style so closely it made my stomach turn. The phrasing, the structure, even a particular way I used semicolons instead of bullet points, but the conclusions were wrong. Not incorrect in an obvious way, just softened, rounded, made safer. I scrolled to the metadata. The author field listed my name. The last editor was someone in management. I closed the document without saving and put the sticky note back exactly where it had been. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't ask questions. I wanted to see how far they would go if no one stopped them. Outside of work, things were changing too, though more subtly. My sister canceled dinner one Friday because her husband's parents were in town. The next week, she forgot to invite me at all. I found out they'd hosted a barbecue from a photo she posted online, her backyard crowded with people I recognized. At the grocery store, I ran into a neighbor I'd lived next to for 3 years. We exchanged polite small talk. As we parted, she said, "Take care," in the tone people use when they assume you're already halfway gone. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like the edges of my life were thinning. Like connections I'd always assumed were solid were actually held together by routine more than intention. One night, after a long shower that didn't manage to quiet my thoughts, I sat on the edge of my bed and tried to pinpoint when that feeling had started. It wasn't after the badge incident. It wasn't after the hallway comment. It went back further, to the day I'd been asked to step aside. At the time, the request had been framed carefully. There were phrases like team alignment and long-term vision. There was concern expressed about how my continued involvement might complicate leadership messaging. I'd nodded. I'd listened. I'd agreed. What I hadn't realized then was that stepping aside didn't create space, it created a vacuum, and vacuums don't stay empty for long. Someone else had filled it. The following Monday, I was called into a meeting with HR. It wasn't disciplinary. At least, not officially. The HR representative smiled a lot. She asked how I was feeling. She mentioned wellness resources and reminded me to take my vacation days. Then she slid a single-page document across the table. It was an updated role description. My title hadn't changed. My salary hadn't changed. But the responsibilities had. Entire sections were gone, replaced with vague language about support functions and ad hoc assistance. I scanned the page once, then again. "This isn't what I've been doing," I said. She nodded sympathetically. "Roles evolve." "Who decided this?" I asked. She hesitated, just for a moment. "Leadership alignment." That phrase again. I didn't sign anything. She didn't ask me to. Instead, she thanked me for my flexibility and told me how much the organization valued my professionalism. When I left the room, my hands were shaking not from anger, but from something closer to disbelief. They weren't pushing me out. They were rewriting me. Over the next 2 weeks, I noticed people avoiding being alone with me. Conversations stopped when I entered rooms. Emails that included me were carefully worded, stripped of opinion. I was being documented. Not overtly. Quietly. Everything was being made to look neutral. Procedural. Reasonable. If something went wrong later, the record would show that my involvement had been minimal, peripheral. I began keeping my own records. Not in any official system. Just a plain notebook I bought at Walgreens on my way home one night. Blue cover, college ruled. I wrote down dates, times, who said what, who was present. I didn't know why yet. I just knew I needed to remember things the way they happened, not the way they would eventually be described. One entry stands out now. October 19th, 3:12 p.m. Manager asked if I'd be comfortable not being listed on a submission to avoid confusion. I remember nodding. Saying, "Sure, it's something 70. I remember the relief on his face. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the notebook open in front of me and realized something that made my chest tighten. They weren't afraid of me being wrong. They were afraid of me being traceable. I thought about the folder again. The documents under my name that weren't mine. The access logs. The drafts. I logged in from home and checked. The folder was gone. No error message. No trace. It was as if it had never existed. I sat back in my chair and stared at the dark screen. This was no longer about recognition or career progression. It wasn't even about fairness in the way I'd always understood it. This was about liability. And I was being positioned very carefully in relation to it. The next morning, as I drove to work, I passed the same flagpole out front. The rope had been fixed. The flag was raised again, snapping sharply in the wind. Everything looked normal. Inside, I did my work. I answered emails. I smiled when spoken to. But something fundamental had shifted. I no longer believed I was being overlooked. I was being prepared. For what, I didn't yet know. But for the first time since March, I stopped asking myself how to make this right. Instead, I started asking a different question. What exactly were they planning to do with the version of me they were quietly creating? Once you accept that something is being done to you deliberately, your mind stops scrambling for reassurance and starts cataloging losses. Not the obvious ones. Not the kind you can point to on a paycheck or a contract. The quieter kind. I began to see what was actually being taken from me, piece by piece, without anyone ever asking permission. The first thing was authorship, not in the artistic sense, in the professional one. The ability to say, "I built this. I decided this. I stand behind this." That line had been slowly erased from my working life. I still produced material. I still reviewed documents. But my fingerprints were being wiped away before anything reached the outside world. When regulators followed up with questions, they no longer came to me. They went to people who had my work in front of them, but not my reasoning behind it. I became a translator of my own ideas, speaking through others. The second thing was credibility. This one was more subtle. It happened in tone, not language. When I spoke in meetings on the rare occasions I was included, people nodded politely, then looked to someone else for confirmation. My statements were treated as inputs, not conclusions. Once, during a discussion about a compliance timeline, I pointed out a conflict with a state-level requirement that hadn't been addressed. The room went quiet for a moment, then my manager said, "We'll circle back on that." They didn't. A week later, the same concern was raised by someone else, almost word for word. It was met with immediate seriousness. Action items were assigned. No one acknowledged the repetition. I sat there, hands folded in my lap, feeling something inside me go very still. The third thing was access. Not just system access, though that continued to shrink in ways that were always explained after the fact. Access to conversations, to informal context, to the unspoken understanding that lets you do your job well. Decisions were being made before meetings ever happened. By the time I heard about them, they were already settled. I was being included only at the point where dissent would be inconvenient. At home, I tried to articulate this loss to myself, but the words didn't come easily. How do you explain that what's being taken isn't tangible, but it still hurts? That no one has violated a rule, yet something essential is gone? I started noticing how often people equated harm with volume. If no one was yelling, it couldn't be abuse. If no one was threatening, it couldn't be coercion. If no one was firing me, it couldn't be punishment. But harm doesn't need noise. It just needs repetition. One afternoon in November, I received a forwarded email from a colleague. She asked if I could double-check a response before it went out. I opened the attachment. It was a letter to a regulator bearing the company letterhead, signed by an executive. The content was mostly accurate, but there was a paragraph near the end that stopped me cold. It referenced a risk assessment that hadn't been completed yet. It implied conclusions that hadn't been reached. If sent as is, it wouldn't trigger immediate penalties. But it would establish a record one that could be revisited later. A record that said we knew. I wrote back carefully, outlining my concerns, citing the specific sections that needed revision. 10 minutes later, my manager replied, "Thanks, we'll take it from here." The letter went out unchanged. I stared at my inbox, my heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. This wasn't just about me anymore. They were using my proximity to legitimacy without giving me authority, borrowing my credibility while distancing themselves from my judgment. I thought about the folder again. The drafts. The metadata. The possibility that my name had been attached to documents without my consent wasn't theoretical anymore. That night, I opened my notebook and added a new heading. Potential exposure. Under it, I listed everything that worried me. The softened language, the premature assurances, the documents that implied certainty where there was none. I didn't know yet what I would do with this information. I only knew that pretending it wasn't happening felt dangerous. Around the same time, something else began to slip away, something I hadn't expected to miss as much as I did. Belonging. Not the performative kind. The quiet understanding that you are part of something, that your presence is assumed, not negotiated. Holiday decorations went up in the office. A sign-up sheet appeared for a potluck lunch. My name wasn't on it. I added it myself, writing "dessert" in neat letters. The day of the potluck, I brought a tray of brownies and set it on the table in the break room. People thanked me, smiled, took pieces. No one asked me to sit with them. I ate alone at my desk, the hum of the printer filling the space where conversation might have been. At home that evening, I tried to distract myself by cleaning. I reorganized a kitchen drawer that didn't need it. I wiped down counters that were already clean. Finally, I sat on the floor with my back against the cabinet and let myself feel it. The grief wasn't sharp. It was dull and persistent. This wasn't the loss of a job or a title. It was the loss of standing. In systems like the one I worked in, standing mattered. It determined whose voice carried weight, whose mistakes were forgiven, whose intentions were assumed to be good. Mine were no longer. I was being repositioned into a space where accountability could be assigned without authority, where my presence provided cover, but my absence would go unnoticed. And still, no one had said anything overtly hostile. That was the most disorienting part. If they had been cruel, I could have named it. If they had been reckless, I could have challenged it. Instead, they were careful, polite, strategic. They were removing me from the narrative while keeping me close enough to absorb risk. The value being taken wasn't money. It was insulation. The insulation that protects you when things go wrong. The buffer of shared responsibility. The assumption that you were part of the decision-making process. Without it, you're exposed. I realized then that the document I'd signed in March hadn't been about stepping aside. It had been about stepping downstream, positioning me where the current could carry consequences toward me without ever giving me the power to change direction. That night, I didn't sleep much. I lay awake listening to the faint sound of traffic outside, thinking about all the times I'd believed that being reasonable would protect me. About all the times I'd chosen to be agreeable instead of clear. I wasn't angry yet, but something else had settled in. A clarity that made one thing undeniable. Whatever they were building, I was no longer meant to be safe inside it. I was meant to be useful, and that was a much more dangerous place to stand. Once I started seeing what was being taken from me, it became impossible not to see how long I'd been trained to give it away. That realization didn't arrive as a single memory or a dramatic revelation. It came in fragments, small scenes from earlier years that resurfaced with a clarity I hadn't had at the time. I began to understand that what was happening at work didn't start at work. It started much earlier, in quieter rooms, with softer voices. Growing up, I was the reliable one, the child who didn't need reminders, the one teachers described as self-directed and relatives praised for being easy. I learned early that approval followed compliance, and compliance required anticipation. If you could sense what others needed before they asked, you could avoid being a burden. I was good at that. When my parents divorced during my senior year of high school, my mother leaned on me in ways she never did with my younger brother. I helped her organize paperwork, listened while she cried at the kitchen table late at night, reassured her that things would be fine. No one told me explicitly that this was my role. It was simply assumed. "You're so mature," people said. I internalized that as instruction. In college, I worked 2 part-time jobs while carrying a full course load. When group projects came up, I took on the coordination work without being asked. When deadlines slipped, I stayed up late to make sure things were finished. I told myself I was being a team player. When credit was distributed unevenly, I shrugged it off. Recognition wasn't the point. Getting things done was. That logic followed me into my career. In my first job out of school, I volunteered for tasks no one else wanted. I took meeting notes. I handled follow-ups. I smoothed over miscommunications before they escalated. When a senior analyst once told me, "You're such a stabilizing presence," I felt proud. I didn't realize what that meant. Stability, in the way institutions use it, doesn't mean safety for everyone. It means predictability for those in power. It means removing friction, even if that friction is created by valid questions or inconvenient truths. I had become very good at absorbing friction. So when I was asked, years later, to step aside for the good of the team, it didn't feel foreign. It felt familiar, like a continuation of a pattern I'd been rewarded for my entire life. Don't push. Don't complicate. Don't insist on being seen. Just keep things running. At work, the pattern repeated itself with remarkable consistency. Each time something went wrong, I was looped in just early enough to help fix it, and just late enough to ensure I wasn't associated with the decision that caused it. Each time there was a risk to manage, my expertise was consulted privately, then stripped of its context before being presented publicly. Each time a difficult conversation needed to be avoided, I was positioned as the reasonable intermediary. I saw now that this wasn't coincidence. This was design. One evening, as I flipped through my notebook, I noticed how often the same phrases appeared in my entries. Asked to review, not to decide. Removed from distribution list. And concerns acknowledged, not acted on. Over and over. I thought back to the first time I'd felt this particular discomfort at the company. It was years earlier, during a cross-departmental audit. I'd flagged a discrepancy that could have led to significant fines if left unaddressed. The leadership team thanked me, then asked if I could help reframe the issue so it didn't raise unnecessary alarms. I had done it. At the time, I'd told myself I was being pragmatic, that change takes time, that not every truth needs to be delivered at full volume. Now, I wondered whether I'd been complicit in something I didn't yet fully understand. At home, my routines began to feel less like comfort and more like avoidance. I cleaned because it gave me something concrete to control. I cooked the same meals because predictability was soothing. I avoided making plans too far in advance because I wasn't sure what my work situation would look like in a few months. When friends asked how things were going, I gave answers that required no follow-up. Fine. Busy. Same as always. It wasn't that I didn't want support. I just didn't know how to explain a problem that didn't have a single cause or a clear villain. How do you say, I think I'm being positioned to take the fall for something that hasn't happened yet without sounding paranoid? One night, after dinner with my sister, I sat in my car for a long time before driving home. She'd mentioned, offhandedly, that her company was going through a restructuring, that a colleague had been managed out after a compliance issue surfaced. They needed someone to point to, she said, shrugging. It's always the people who aren't protected. The word lodged itself in my mind. Protected. I wasn't. Not because I'd done anything wrong, but because I'd never insisted on being right in ways that were visible. At work, the situation continued to evolve in small, precise ways. I was no longer invited to planning sessions, but I was asked to prepare materials for them. I was copied on emails after decisions were made, framed as updates rather than discussions. Once, I received a request to sign off on a document that I hadn't reviewed. When I pointed this out, I was told it was just a formality. I refused. The request came back 2 days later, slightly reworded, with my manager CC'd. I refused again. No one argued with me. No one pressured me. The document was eventually signed by someone else. After that, I noticed a subtle shift. Tasks that required judgment stopped coming my way. Tasks that required execution continued. It was as if the system were adjusting, finding a new equilibrium that excluded my discretion. I thought again about the phrase organizational stability. I saw now that stability wasn't a shared condition, it was something achieved by redistributing risk downward. The people at the top remained insulated. The people at the bottom absorbed impact. And the people in the middle, people like me, were expected to make that redistribution look seamless. I had been doing that work for years without naming it. The realization didn't make me feel righteous or indignant. It made me tired. Tired of being reasonable. Tired of being adaptable. Tired of being the person who made hard things easier for others while quietly carrying the weight. Late one night, I pulled out the document I'd signed back in March and read it again. This time, I noticed something I'd glossed over before. A clause about cooperation in future inquiries. At the time, it had seemed innocuous, a standard provision. Now, it read differently. It positioned me as someone who could be called upon, someone expected to assist, someone whose previous involvement might be relevant later. I closed the laptop and sat back in my chair, the room silent around me. For the first time, I allowed myself to say it out loud, even if only to an empty room. This isn't accidental. And it isn't temporary. The pattern was too consistent, too well practiced. I wasn't being sidelined because I lacked value. I was being sidelined because my value was useful in a very specific way, and only as long as I stayed where they put me. That was the moment something fundamental shifted. Not toward anger, not yet. Toward resolve. I didn't know what I would do with that resolve. I didn't have a plan. But I knew this much. I would not continue to call this normal. And I would not keep pretending that the cost of being easy was something I could afford to ignore. Whatever came next, I would meet it with my eyes open, even if that meant finally stepping out of the role I'd been trained to play my entire life. The event that finally broke the illusion didn't arrive with urgency. There was no emergency meeting, no sharp email marked important. It came disguised as routine, folded neatly into the rhythm of a Tuesday morning. I noticed it because my calendar behaved differently. At 9:08 a.m., a meeting appeared already accepted on my behalf. No subject line, just a block of time labeled regulatory alignment. The organizer was someone 2 levels above my manager, someone I'd spoken to exactly 3 times in 5 years. I hovered over the invite, waiting for the details to load. There were none. No agenda, No call-in information, just a conference room on the fourth floor I hadn't been in since before the pandemic. I considered declining. I even moved my cursor toward the button. Instead, I let it sit. That hesitation would matter later. The meeting started at 2 p.m., sharp. When I arrived, the room was already half full. People were seated in pairs, leaning in toward each other, voices low. Conversations stopped as I entered. Not abruptly, just enough. I took a seat near the end of the table, notebook in front of me, pen aligned carefully along the spine. Old habits. My manager didn't look at me. The senior director cleared his throat and began speaking as if everyone already knew why we were there. He talked about external review pressure, about the importance of clear accountability, about the need to demonstrate decisive corrective action in response to potential compliance gaps. He never once said the word error. Slides appeared on the screen, timelines, flowcharts, arrows pointing inward. I recognized them immediately. They were built on the framework I'd designed, simplified, repackaged, and stripped of context. As the presentation continued, something else became clear. The narrative had been arranged carefully. It suggested that certain decisions had been made at an operational level, without adequate escalation. That documentation had been inconsistent. That internal controls had relied too heavily on individual judgment. My judgment. My name wasn't on the slides, but it didn't need to be. The room understood the implication. I felt a strange calm settle over me as I listened. Not relief, not shock, recognition. This was the endpoint of the pattern I'd been tracing for months. They weren't pushing me out. They were positioning me forward. As the discussion opened up, people began asking questions, not to me directly, but about the role I occupied. How much autonomy did that function have? Was there oversight? Were there documented approvals? Each question narrowed the frame. Finally, the senior director turned toward me. "Can you walk us through your involvement?" The room went quiet. This was the moment the document had prepared for. The moment the access changes, the quiet exclusions, the softened drafts had been shaping. I could feel the weight of it pressing down, not dramatic, not explosive, just dense and heavy. I thought about all the times I'd been asked to be reasonable, to be flexible, to help everyone. I thought about the notebook in my bag, the dates, the phrases, the erased folder. I also thought about something else. If I spoke the way they expected, if I summarized, contextualized, and absorbed the ambiguity, this meeting would end with clarity for them and exposure for me. If I didn't, the room would shift. I chose my words carefully. "I can explain what I was responsible for," I said, my voice steady, "and what I wasn't." There was a pause. Small, noticeable. I outlined my role precisely. The scope, the limitations, the points where decisions moved beyond my authority. I referenced dates, escalations, requests that hadn't been acted on. I didn't accuse. I didn't editorialize. I stayed inside the facts. As I spoke, I saw expressions change. Not dramatically, just enough to register discomfort. The senior director interrupted me. "We don't need that level of detail," he said. "This is about alignment." I nodded. "Understood," I replied. "But accuracy matters." The room went still. Someone shifted in their chair. Another person glanced at their phone, then quickly put it away. I stopped talking. I didn't fill the silence. Eventually, the director cleared his throat again and moved the meeting forward. Action items were assigned. Language was adjusted. A smaller working group was formed. I was not included. The meeting ended 15 minutes early. As people filed out, my manager finally looked at me. His expression was tight. "We'll talk later," he said. We didn't. Instead, I received an email an hour later thanking me for my measured contribution and reminding me to route all future inquiries through management to ensure consistency. That night, I sat in my car in the parking lot long after the building had emptied. The sky was already dark, the air sharp with the kind of cold that settles into your bones. I didn't turn the engine on. I replayed the meeting in my mind, not looking for mistakes, but for confirmation. There it was. The line had been crossed. Not by me. By the system that had assumed I would continue to step back indefinitely. The next day, I noticed changes immediately. My inbox filled with messages I'd never been copied on before. Requests for clarification. Questions framed carefully, as if trying to pull information without context. I responded to some. I declined others. At noon, HR emailed to schedule a check-in. I accepted. The HR representative smiled, just as she always did. She asked about my workload, about stress levels, about whether I felt supported. Then she mentioned the meeting. It raised some questions, she said lightly. About alignment. I waited. She continued. We want to make sure everyone is clear on expectations moving forward. She slid a document across the table. It was a statement, not disciplinary, not corrective, just a summary of understandings. It included phrases like operational discretion and individual judgment calls. It framed my role as more autonomous than it had ever been. I read it slowly. Then I pushed it back. This isn't accurate, I said. She looked surprised. Not offended. We can revise the language, she offered. It's not the language, I replied. It's the premise. Her smile faded slightly. I'm not comfortable signing something that misrepresents how decisions were made. There it was. The point of no return. She didn't argue. She didn't insist. She simply nodded and said, We'll note your concerns. As I left the room, I felt something settle into place. This wasn't about saving my job. It wasn't even about clearing my name. It was about refusing to participate in a version of events that required my silence to function. That afternoon, I went back to my desk and did something I hadn't done since this all began. I opened my notebook and wrote a single line across a clean page. I will not make this easier. Not out of spite, out of clarity. Because I finally understood what stepping back had cost me and what stepping back again would cost even more. Whatever happened next, I would not be the smooth surface they needed to redirect consequence. I didn't yet know how far this would go, but I knew the shape of it now. The system had made its move, and by choosing not to disappear quietly, I had made mine. After the meeting, time behaved strangely. Days passed quickly at work and slowly everywhere else. I moved through my tasks with a new kind of focus, not urgency, but precision. I stopped offering help that wasn't requested. I stopped anticipating needs that hadn't been articulated. If someone wanted my input, they had to ask for it directly. Most didn't. The inbox noise increased, but the substance didn't. Messages arrived, carefully worded, scrubbed of implication. Questions that once would have been part of an open conversation were now isolated, stripped down to single points, as if context itself had become dangerous. I answered what I could without compromising accuracy. Everything else, I documented. One evening in early December, I stayed late again. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted quiet. The building after hours had a different energy, less performance, fewer masks. Just the low hum of HVAC and the occasional echo of footsteps from another floor. I logged in to review a set of files related to the regulatory inquiry. My access was limited now, but not non-existent. Enough remained to let me see fragments. I clicked through directories methodically, not looking for anything in particular, just observing. That's when I found the audit trail. It wasn't labeled in a way that drew attention. No red flags, no warnings. Just a nested set of system logs attached to a project folder that, according to official records, I had never touched. The timestamps spanned nearly 18 months. I scrolled slowly. Entries appeared and disappeared as permissions changed. Documents were uploaded, edited, then reassigned. Ownership fields were altered. Review notes were added and removed. And threaded through all of it was a pattern I couldn't ignore. My credentials had been used to open files I'd never seen. My name had been attached to drafts I hadn't authored. My access had been invoked at moments that aligned perfectly with key decision points. The realization didn't hit me like a punch. It landed like weight. This wasn't sloppiness. This wasn't miscommunication. This was scaffolding. Someone had been building a version of events that placed me exactly where they needed me, close enough to plausibility, distant enough from authority. I checked the access logs again, this time more carefully. Every instance where my credentials appeared corresponded to a period when I had been traveling, out sick, or otherwise demonstrably unavailable. Someone had known that. Someone had planned around it. My hands were steady as I copied the logs into a secure folder on a personal drive I kept encrypted for tax documents and legal paperwork. I didn't rush. I didn't skim. I read everything. By the time I shut down my computer, it was nearly 9 p.m. The office was empty. I sat there for a moment longer, staring at the darkened screen, trying to process what I'd found. This wasn't evidence in the dramatic sense. No smoking gun, no explicit instruction that said, "Use her name." It was worse than that. It was plausible deniability, engineered line by line. I drove home in silence, the radio off, the dashboard clock glowing an accusatory 9 to 47 p.m. At home, I didn't turn on any lights. I stood in the kitchen, still wearing my coat, and let the quiet settle around me. I thought about the document I'd signed, the clause about cooperation. I thought about the meeting, the questions framed just broadly enough to catch me. I thought about how carefully my role had been redefined. They hadn't needed me to do anything wrong. They just needed me to exist in the right place, at the right time, with the right proximity. I slept poorly that night. The next morning, I called in sick for the first time in years. I spent the day organizing what I had, not just the logs, but everything else, the emails, the meeting invites, the revised role descriptions, the notebook entries. I laid them out chronologically, not on paper, but in my mind. A narrative emerged, not the one they were building. The real one. It was methodical, boring, even. No villains twirling mustaches, no dramatic betrayals, just a system doing what systems do when pressure mounts, shifting risk downward until it finds someone who won't resist. I realized then why the erasure had happened before the exposure. They hadn't removed me because I was inconvenient. They'd removed me because I was useful. If my voice wasn't part of the decision-making process, then my objections couldn't complicate the story later. If my access was limited, then my denials would sound like ignorance. If my role was vague, then my responsibility could be framed flexibly. They had built a silhouette of me, and they were preparing to hang it on the wall. That afternoon, my phone rang. It was my manager. I let it go to voicemail. He left a message asking if I was feeling better, then added, almost casually, that the company's legal team might be reaching out with a few clarifying questions in the coming days. The phrase made my stomach tighten. Clarifying questions were rarely about clarity. They were about record. I didn't call him back. Instead, I did something I hadn't considered seriously before. I scheduled a consultation. The attorney's office was in a low brick building near downtown, the kind that housed tax preparers and family practices. Nothing imposing, nothing flashy. The attorney herself was in her early 40s, dressed plainly, her desk neat but lived in. She listened without interrupting as I explained the situation, not emotionally, just factually. When I finished, she leaned back slightly and folded her hands. "They're not trying to fire you," she said. I nodded. "I know. They're trying to isolate liability," she continued. "And you're in the line of fire." I slid the access logs across the desk. Her eyes sharpened as she scanned them. "This," she said, tapping the page, "is not an accident." She didn't tell me what to do. She didn't promise outcomes. She explained options. Most of them involved escalation, disclosure, formal complaints, paths that would put my name into systems I didn't trust. When I left her office, the winter sun was already low in the sky. I sat in my car and watched people walk past, their breath visible in the cold. I thought about the cost of action, not just professionally, but personally. The scrutiny, the questions, the way people would look at me differently once I was no longer quiet. Then I thought about the cost of inaction, the slow suffocation of being written into a story that wasn't true. That night, I made a decision not about what I would do immediately, but about what I would no longer do. I would no longer correct their narrative privately while allowing it to stand publicly. I would no longer provide cover. If they wanted my cooperation, it would have to be explicit, documented, accurate. The next morning, an email arrived from legal. They requested a meeting to align on facts. I accepted. I didn't volunteer anything. I answered questions directly, precisely, and without interpretation. When they asked about documents I hadn't authored, I said so. When they referenced decisions I hadn't made, I clarified. When they suggested timelines that didn't match my records, I corrected them. They took notes. They thanked me. The meeting ended politely. Afterward, I sat alone in a small conference room and felt the weight of what I had done. I hadn't accused anyone. I hadn't exposed anything publicly. But I had refused to participate in fiction. And that, I understood now, was the most dangerous thing I could do in a system built on quiet compliance. As I packed up my notebook, I noticed something small but telling. The conference room whiteboard still had notes from the previous meeting, bullet points, arrows. In the corner, half erased, was a phrase written in red marker, "Contain fallout." I stared at it for a long moment before turning off the lights and leaving the room. They had assumed I wouldn't read the record closely. They had assumed I wouldn't understand the structure they were building. They had assumed, above all, that I would stay reasonable. They were wrong. And now that I had seen the shape of the truth, there was no way back to not seeing it. Whatever came next, it would not be quiet. Not because I would make noise, but because the silence they depended on was no longer available to them. After the meeting with legal, nothing exploded. No reprimand. No follow-up email marked urgent. No sudden change in my access or my title. That was the part that unsettled me most. In movies, truth creates momentum. In real organizations, it creates calculation. For the next 2 weeks, everything went quiet in a way that felt deliberate. My calendar remained sparse. My inbox stayed neutral. People were polite, distant, careful. I could feel the system recalibrating around me. At home, I felt the tension differently. It showed up in my body more than my thoughts. Tight shoulders, shallow sleep, a constant sense that I was waiting for something without knowing what it was. Every night, I asked myself the same question in different forms. Do I escalate? Do I protect myself loudly? Do I force this into the open? Each option came with a version of victory and a version of loss. If I filed a formal complaint, the narrative would shift immediately. I would become a problem to be managed, a risk to be contained. Everything I said would be filtered through that lens. If I went public, even internally, the truth would be debated instead of addressed. Motives would be questioned. Intent would matter more than facts. And if I stayed silent, the structure they'd built could still collapse onto me when it was convenient. None of the choices were clean. One evening, I sat at my kitchen table with my notebook open, flipping through pages I knew almost by heart. Dates, names, phrases repeated often enough to form a rhythm. I realized something then that I hadn't fully articulated before. They didn't need me to fight them. They needed me to react. Every option that involved confrontation required me to step into a role they understood. The disgruntled employee, the whistleblower, the liability. Those roles came with scripts, with procedures, with ways to neutralize impact. What they didn't have a script for was refusal without noise. I thought about the attorney's words. Isolate liability. Liability requires participation, even if that participation is protest. What happens, I wondered, if you don't give them that? The answer came slowly, not as a plan, but as a principle. I would not expose them, and I would not protect them. I would do something far less dramatic and far more disruptive. I would become exact. From that point forward, I stopped offering explanations. I stopped smoothing language. I stopped translating complexity into comfort. If someone asked a question, I answered it precisely as asked, no more and no less. If a document required my input, I reviewed only the sections explicitly assigned to me and noted, in writing, the limits of that review. When asked to just take a look at something informal, I declined. Happy to review if you'd like to route it officially, I wrote. Please let me know. Some people were irritated by this, others seemed relieved. The system slowed. Not dramatically, just enough to be noticed. Projects took longer, decisions required clearer ownership, emails became more explicit. Where ambiguity had once flowed easily, it now encountered friction. I wasn't obstructing, I was clarifying. At the same time, I began to quietly remove myself from exposure. I documented everything, but I didn't distribute it. I stored it, time-stamped it, organized it. I requested written confirmation for requests that had previously been verbal. I followed up conversations with brief summaries sent to all parties involved. Nothing accusatory. Nothing emotional. Just record. This approach wasn't without risk. It made some people uncomfortable. It disrupted patterns they were used to. But it didn't give them a hook. There was no outburst to discipline, no complaint to investigate, no headline to manage. Just a person doing her job exactly as defined. One afternoon, my manager stopped by my desk. He looked tired, older than he had a few months earlier. "Is everything okay?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "Why?" He hesitated. "You seem different." I considered that. "I'm being careful," I replied. He nodded slowly, as if trying to decide what that meant for him. "We're all under pressure," he said. "We need to be aligned." And crossed in the first place. "I agree," I said. Alignment requires clarity. He didn't argue with that. After he left, I felt a flicker of something unexpected. Not satisfaction. Relief. For the first time in months, I wasn't trying to manage his perception of me. I wasn't trying to be palatable or reassuring. I was simply present. The pressure didn't disappear, but it changed shape. It became external instead of internal. I wasn't carrying their anxiety anymore. At home, I noticed changes too. I slept better, even if not longer. My thoughts felt sharper, more contained. I stopped replaying conversations in my head, wondering what I should have said differently. There was nothing to revise. I had said what was accurate. Still, there were moments of doubt. Late at night, I wondered if I was making a mistake by not acting more forcefully, by not protecting myself, in the way people often mean by getting ahead of the story. But each time that thought surfaced, another followed close behind. Getting ahead of which story? The one they were telling? Or the one the system would eventually tell itself when the facts no longer lined up? I didn't need to win an argument. I needed to not be available as a solution to their problem. Weeks passed. The regulatory inquiry deepened. Requests from outside counsel became more frequent, more pointed. The language in emails shifted from general to specific. Names began to matter. Ownership began to matter. I stayed exactly where I was. When asked to confirm involvement, I did so accurately. When asked to speculate, I declined. "I can't speak to that," I wrote. I wasn't part of that decision. Sometimes, there was a pause before the response came back. Sometimes, there was no response at all. The organization was learning something it hadn't expected. I wasn't fighting them. I was refusing to buffer the impact of their own structure. One Friday afternoon, as I packed up to leave, I noticed the flag out front again. It was half-mast. I hadn't heard why. It occurred to me that I didn't need to know. Symbols don't explain themselves, they just signal. That weekend, I didn't open my laptop. I went for long walks. I cooked meals that took time. I let my body catch up to decisions my mind had already made. By Monday, I felt steady. Not confident, not triumphant. Clear. When the next meeting request came, another alignment session, I accepted without hesitation. I knew what I would do there. I would not argue. I would not confess. I would not explain beyond the facts. I would let the system encounter itself. The decision I had made wasn't about justice in the abstract. It was about refusing to absorb the cost of a structure that relied on my silence to function. I wasn't going to burn anything down. I was simply going to stop holding it up. And whatever happened after that would not be because I acted recklessly or emotionally. It would be because the truth, unpadded and unprotected, has a way of redistributing weight. I didn't know yet where that redistribution would land, but for the first time since March, I trusted myself enough to let it happen. The change didn't announce itself. There was no moment where I woke up feeling free. No clean break between before and after. What happened instead was quieter, almost mundane. The absence of constant vigilance created space, and that space slowly filled with things that had nothing to do with them. At work, I remained where I was. Same desk, same title, same unremarkable presence in the organizational chart. But the way I inhabited that role was different now. I arrived on time and left on time. I completed what was assigned to me and nothing that wasn't. I no longer scanned emails for hidden meanings or tried to anticipate what people might need before they asked. When a request was vague, I asked for clarification. When a responsibility wasn't mine, I said so. When something fell outside my scope, I let it stay there. The effect was subtle but noticeable. People adjusted. Some stopped coming to me entirely, choosing paths of least resistance elsewhere. Others learned quickly that if they wanted my involvement, they needed to be precise. The work slowed down in places where it had once flowed effortlessly through me. No one said anything about it. They didn't need to. Systems respond to friction whether they acknowledge it or not. Outside the office, I began to rebuild parts of my life I hadn't realized were neglected. On weeknights, instead of collapsing on the couch with my laptop open, I took long walks through my neighborhood. The sidewalks were uneven, cracked by years of Midwest winters, but I learned which routes were smoother, which streets were quieter. I noticed things I'd rushed past before: the house on the corner that always smelled like garlic and onions around dinner time, the older man who walked his dog at exactly the same hour every evening, the woman down the block who practiced cello with her windows open, her music drifting out in hesitant phrases. None of them knew anything about my job. None of them needed to. I signed up for a Saturday morning class at the community center. Nothing ambitious, just a writing workshop that met for 2 hours every other week. I didn't tell anyone at work. I didn't frame it as professional development. It was simply something I wanted. At first, it felt indulgent. Then it felt grounding. In that room, no one cared about my role or my reputation. We talked about sentences, about rhythm, about clarity. I realized how long it had been since I'd enjoyed precision for its own sake, rather than as a defensive measure. The same shift happened in smaller ways. I stopped answering my phone immediately when my sister called, not out of resentment, but because I no longer felt obligated to be constantly available. When we did talk, I didn't automatically smooth over my answers. When she asked how work was going, I said, "It's complicated," and let the silence sit. She didn't press. I didn't elaborate. It felt honest. As weeks turned into months, the situation at work continued to evolve without me being at the center of it. The regulatory inquiry deepened. External consultants appeared on calendars. Meetings multiplied, then splintered into smaller, more focused groups. I was asked to provide factual timelines more than once. Each time, I did so carefully, referencing only what I could personally verify. No opinions, no speculation. Just record. Sometimes, after sending those emails, I would sit back and feel a familiar flicker of fear. Had I said too much? Had I said too little? Then I would remind myself of the decision I'd made. I wasn't trying to control the outcome. I was controlling my participation. The rest wasn't mine to manage. One evening, I stayed late not to work, but to pack up things I didn't need anymore. Old binders. Printed reference materials that were now outdated. Notes from projects that no longer existed. As I cleared out a drawer, I found the fake plant from Target. One of its leaves had fallen off and been taped back on at some point. The tape yellowed with age. I threw it away. The desk looked bare afterward, clean. I realized then that I no longer thought of the office as a place I needed to belong. It was a place I passed through. That distinction mattered more than I'd expected. At home, the sense of rebuilding continued. I reorganized my finances, not because something was wrong, but because I wanted a clearer picture of my options. I met with a financial advisor for the first time, asking questions I'd avoided before because they felt premature. What if I left? What if I didn't? The answers didn't lock me into a plan. They loosened something instead. I began to understand that my stability didn't have to be tied to an institution that saw me as a variable to manage. Stability could be something I assembled myself. The idea was both comforting and unsettling. At work, I noticed something else changing. People were more cautious around me. Not hostile, just careful. They checked their language, they looped others in. They documented decisions more thoroughly. I wasn't being isolated anymore. I was being respected at a distance. That was fine with me. One afternoon, a junior analyst stopped by my desk. She looked nervous. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course," I replied. She hesitated, then said, "How do you know when to say no?" The question caught me off guard. I considered it before answering. "When saying yes would make you responsible for something you can't control," I said. She nodded slowly, as if filing that away for later. "Thank you," she said, and left. I watched her go, feeling something close to pride. Not because I'd influenced her, because I'd finally articulated something I believed. As winter settled in, the pace of life slowed naturally. Snow softened the edges of the streets, sound carried differently. I spent evenings reading, writing, cooking meals that took time. I didn't check my work email on my phone anymore. I waited until morning. The urgency that had once dominated my thoughts faded. I knew things were still happening at the company. I could sense the tension beneath the surface, the way people spoke in more guarded tones. But it no longer consumed me. I wasn't building an escape plan. I was building a life that didn't require their approval to feel complete. That distinction would matter later, though I didn't know how yet. What I did know was this. For the first time in a long while, my sense of self wasn't anchored to how well I managed other people's expectations. It was anchored to how clearly I understood my own boundaries. And whatever came next, whatever consequences unfolded, I would meet them from that place. Not scrambling, not apologizing, standing in a life that existed whether or not they acknowledged it. That was the real rebuilding. Quiet, unremarkable, and, as it turned out, far more disruptive than I'd ever intended. The email arrived on a Monday morning, just after 8:30. It wasn't marked urgent, it didn't need to be. The subject line read, "Quick check-in." I stared at it for a few seconds longer than usual, then opened it. The message was brief, almost friendly. My manager wanted to reconnect, he wrote. Things had been moving quickly, and leadership felt it would be helpful to touch base. He suggested lunch later that week. His tone was casual, almost nostalgic, like we were old colleagues who hadn't caught up in a while. I read it twice. This wasn't concern. This wasn't reconciliation. This was confidence. They wouldn't be reaching out like this if they felt threatened. They wouldn't be softening their language if they thought I had leverage. Something had shifted on their side, and they believed the shift favored them. I replied with a single sentence. Thursday works. I have 2 pros in the redder. The restaurant he chose was downtown, one of those places with exposed brick and Edison bulbs, designed to feel informal while still signaling importance. He arrived 5 minutes late, smiling as if we'd bumped into each other by accident. "How have you been?" he asked as we sat down. "Fine," I said. And I meant it. We ordered. He talked about the weather, about how busy things had been, about how challenging it was to keep everyone aligned with so much external scrutiny. I listened. Eventually, he leaned back slightly and said, "I wanted to check in because there's been some concern that you might be feeling sidelined." There it was. Not an apology, not an acknowledgement, a reframing. "I appreciate you saying that," I replied. He nodded, encouraged. "The thing is," he continued, "we're all under pressure right now, and we really value people who can see the big picture." I waited. He took a sip of water. "You've always been good at that." I recognized the move immediately. The appeal to identity. The reminder of the role I used to play. Stabilizer. Interpreter. Buffer. "We're at a point," he went on, "where it's important not to complicate things unnecessarily." There it was again. The word complicate doing heavy lifting. I set my fork down carefully. "What does that mean, specifically?" I asked. He smiled, but it didn't quite settle into his eyes. "It means," he said, "that we want to make sure everyone is aligned on messaging, on roles, on how we present information externally." I nodded. "And how do you see my role in that?" I asked. He hesitated, just long enough to tell me he hadn't expected the question to be asked so directly. "Well," he said, "you've stepped back operationally, which has helped. But your historical knowledge is still important. We may need you to contextualize certain things if questions come up." It's contextualize, translate, soften, absorb. "I see," I said. He leaned forward slightly. "This doesn't have to be adversarial. We all want the same thing. Stability," I thought. Containment. "What happens if I don't agree with the context being presented?" I asked. He laughed softly, as if I'd made a joke. "I don't think that will be an issue," he said. The server arrived with our food, interrupting the moment. He used the pause to reset his expression, returning to small talk until the plates were cleared. As we stood to leave, he placed a hand briefly on my shoulder. "We're glad you're here," he said. "Not everyone handles change as gracefully as you have." Graceful. The word followed me all the way back to my car. That afternoon, I noticed a subtle shift in how people interacted with me at the office. More smiles. More casual check-ins. A few invitations to meetings, not central ones, but adjacent. It was as if they'd decided I was no longer a risk. I let it happen. I attended the meetings. I listened. I asked neutral questions. I offered no unsolicited insight. They relaxed further. A week later, legal reached out again, this time with a more collaborative tone. They wanted to validate understanding of certain timelines. They thanked me for my previous cooperation. The word made me almost smile. I provided the same level of precision I always had, nothing more, nothing less. After the call, I sat at my desk and realized what they believed. They believed I had chosen survival over principle, that I'd made peace with being diminished, that my silence meant acceptance. They believed I was done. That belief gave them confidence. Confidence makes people careless. It showed up in small ways at first. An email forwarded to me by mistake, containing a draft summary that overstated internal consensus. A meeting note that attributed agreement where there had been none. A comment made in passing in the break room. "At least we know where the weak spots are now." I didn't react. I wrote things down. At home, my life continued to expand in ways that felt almost unrelated to what was happening at work. The writing class ended, but I kept writing, not about work, about memory, about places I'd lived, about decisions that seemed small at the time but turned out not to be. I went to dinner with people who knew nothing about compliance or corporate politics, people who asked different questions, people who didn't need me to be useful. The contrast sharpened my perspective. At work, usefulness was transactional. At home, presence was enough. One evening, as I walked through my neighborhood, I thought about the lunch again, about the way my manager had framed everything as concern. He hadn't come to see how I was doing. He'd come to confirm that I wouldn't disrupt the story they were preparing to tell. The next development came sooner than I expected. On a Friday afternoon, just before most people logged off, an all-hands meeting was announced for the following Monday. Mandatory attendance. No agenda. The rumor mill ignited immediately. People speculated quietly, then less quietly. I didn't speculate. I already knew what it would be about. By then, the regulatory inquiry had reached a stage where the company needed to demonstrate decisive action. Not corrections, those took time. But accountability, someone had to be named. As the weekend approached, I felt an unexpected calm. I had no illusions about what they might try to do. But I also knew something they didn't. I wasn't standing where they thought I was anymore. They believed I'd retreated, that I'd accepted a smaller version of myself to stay safe. They believed that because it made sense to them. People who rely on others to absorb impact assume that absorption is endless. They mistake endurance for consent. By Sunday night, as I set out my clothes for the morning and prepared my bag, I understood exactly what this moment was. Not a confrontation. A test. They were about to see whether the version of me they'd carefully constructed would behave the way they needed her to. They were confident she would. After all, she always had. What they didn't know, what they had never bothered to check, was that the person they'd been managing for months no longer existed. And when the system finally asked for what it had been setting me up to give, it would find that the surface it depended on had quietly hardened. Not enough to shatter anything. Just enough that the weight they were about to place would no longer land where they expected. They thought I was done. What they didn't realize was that this was the first moment they'd stopped controlling the outcome. And systems, once they lose that control, have a habit of revealing exactly how they work. The all-hands meeting began at 9 a.m. exactly. Every conference room was booked. Remote employees logged in early, their cameras angled carefully, faces arranged into neutral expressions. The senior leadership team sat in a straight line at the front of the largest room, backs rigid, hands folded on the table like they'd rehearsed the posture. I took a seat near the middle, not hidden, not prominent. From where I sat, I could see the exits. The CEO opened with a prepared statement. He spoke about commitment, about transparency, about learning from challenges. His voice carried the calm authority of someone used to delivering reassurance without promising specifics. Then the general counsel took over. She clicked through slides that summarized the inquiry. Timelines, findings, areas for improvement. The language was careful, the conclusions restrained. It was exactly the tone I'd expected, serious enough to satisfy regulators, vague enough to protect leadership. As she spoke, I noticed something small. The slides had changed since the last version I'd seen. Not dramatically, just enough. References to operational autonomy had been replaced with cross-functional review. Mentions of individual judgment had softened into process gaps. The silhouette they'd been building of me had been adjusted. I felt a flicker of something, not relief, but confirmation. They were trying to land this without a fall guy. That told me everything I needed to know. The CEO cleared his throat. "Before we conclude," he said, "we want to address next steps." He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. "We've been cooperating fully with external reviewers," he continued. "And as part of that process, certain internal practices will be examined more closely." The word internal hung in the air. He gestured to the general counsel again. She nodded and said, "As a reminder, accuracy in our communications is essential. If anyone has information that hasn't yet been shared, now is the time to ensure it's documented." It wasn't a threat. It was an invitation. An invitation designed to draw out confessions, clarifications, or most likely silence. The room stayed quiet. I could feel eyes flicking toward me, then away again, subtle, careful, as if acknowledging me too directly might trigger something they didn't want to deal with. The meeting moved toward its close. That's when the external counsel joined the call. He hadn't been announced. He simply appeared on the screen, his name and firm displayed beneath his face. He thanked leadership for their cooperation, then said something that shifted the room's energy immediately. "There's one procedural matter we need to clarify," he said. "It concerns access logs." "Is one thing." The general counsel's posture stiffened. The external attorney continued. "Specifically, discrepancies between documented authorship and system-level activity." I felt my pulse slow. This wasn't coming from me. This was coming from the record. He shared his screen. A timeline appeared, showing document access patterns overlaid with role changes. Names were anonymized at first. Positions labeled generically. He walked through it methodically, pointing out how credentials had been used, reassigned, and invoked during critical periods. "This pattern," he said, "suggests a breakdown in access controls. No accusation, just observation." Then he clicked to the next slide. The anonymization dropped away. Names appeared. Not mine. Not only mine, anyway. Multiple names, across management levels. Silence filled the room in a way that felt different from before. Thicker, heavier. The external attorney didn't look surprised. He looked prepared. "These findings raise questions," he continued, "about internal accountability structures." He paused. "We'll be following up directly with individuals whose access patterns indicate procedural anomalies." I watched the leadership team carefully. No one looked at me. They were too busy looking at each other. The CEO tried to recover. "Of course," he said. "We take these matters seriously." The external counsel nodded. "We know. That's why we're documenting everything." The meeting ended shortly after that. There was no announcement, no resolution, just a vague promise of continued cooperation. As people filed out, the room buzzed with low conversation. Phones appeared in hands. Messages were typed quickly, then erased, then typed again. I stayed seated until most people had left. My manager passed by without making eye contact. Legal didn't reach out. No one did. That afternoon, emails began circulating not to me, but around me. Requests for explanations, requests for logs, requests for confirmation of access histories. The system was turning inward. By the end of the day, 2 people had been placed on administrative leave. By the end of the week, there were more. Still, no one contacted me. Not to accuse, not to apologize, not to ask for help. I had become something else entirely. Not a buffer, not a liability, a boundary. I went home that evening and cooked dinner slowly. I washed dishes by hand even though the dishwasher was empty. I listened to the sound of water and let my shoulders drop. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was waiting for something to happen. It already had. The following week was a blur of activity I observed from the outside. Meetings multiplied, then canceled. Policies were revised. Access controls tightened abruptly. Language in emails became rigid, formal, stripped of casual phrasing. People who had once moved freely now asked permission. I continued doing my job exactly as defined. No more. No less. One afternoon, the general counsel stopped by my desk. She looked tired. "We may need to ask you a few more questions," she said. "Of course," I replied. "Happy to answer what I can." She hesitated. "You've been very careful," she said. "Yes," I said. She nodded slowly, as if that explained something she hadn't quite understood before. When she walked away, I realized something important. They hadn't miscalculated because they were careless. They had miscalculated because they assumed silence meant alignment. They believed that as long as I wasn't fighting them, I was protecting them. They had never considered the possibility that I would do neither. I didn't expose them. I didn't defend them. I let the system encounter the truth it had recorded about itself. That was the twist they hadn't planned for. In environments built on managed narratives, truth doesn't need a champion. It just needs room. By the time the dust began to settle, the organization looked different. Flatter, more rigid, less confident. People spoke carefully, aware now that the record mattered more than intention. I wasn't celebrated. I wasn't vindicated. No one came to me with an apology or an admission, and I didn't need them to. The outcome wasn't moral in the way stories like to frame things. There was no speech, no public reckoning. There was only consequence distributed not by revenge, but by structure. One evening, as I packed up to leave, I passed the conference room where it had all started. The whiteboard was clean now. No red marker, no half-erased phrases. The system had erased its own notes. Outside, the flag was back at full height, moving in the wind. I paused for a moment, then kept walking. I hadn't won. I hadn't lost. I had simply stopped absorbing the cost of something that wasn't mine to carry. And when that happened, the weight went where it had always belonged. In the weeks that followed, the office settled into a new rhythm. Not a better one, just a different one. Policies were updated. Access permissions were tightened. New approval layers appeared where none had existed before. Everything moved more slowly, weighed down by its own caution. People spoke in careful sentences. Emails grew longer, more precise. Meetings ended with explicit summaries, responsibilities spelled out line by line. The system had learned something. So had I. No one ever sat me down to explain what had happened. No official narrative was offered, no internal memo thanking anyone for their cooperation. The company moved forward without acknowledging the shift directly, as if naming it might give it more power than they wanted to allow. I stayed. Not because I felt loyalty, and not because I felt trapped. Because I no longer needed the place to mean something it couldn't. That made all the difference. At work, my role remained modest. I was included where my expertise was relevant and excluded where it wasn't. I answered questions when asked. I declined speculation when invited. No one tried to use my name again. No one needed to. The structure itself had become more cautious, less reliant on quiet intermediaries. Risk was now distributed upward instead of down. That wasn't justice. It was correction. And correction, I learned, doesn't come with applause. One afternoon, several months later, I was asked to review a new internal policy draft. The language was dense, the tone defensive. I read it carefully, marked a few areas where clarity was lacking, and sent it back. The response came quickly. "Thanks," the email read. "This is helpful. Nothing more." I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair, surprised by the absence of any emotional reaction. There was a time when that kind of acknowledgement would have mattered deeply to me, when I would have replayed it in my mind, looking for signs of appreciation or acceptance. Now, it was just information. At home, life continued to expand in quiet, unremarkable ways. I kept writing. Not for publication or recognition, just for myself. Pages filled notebooks. Some entries were polished, most weren't. I took a short trip alone in early spring, driving west until the landscape flattened into open fields. I stayed in a small motel, ate at a diner where the waitress called everyone "hun," and spent hours walking without a destination. No one there knew my job title. No one asked what I did for a living. It felt like permission I hadn't realized I was waiting for. When I returned, my sister commented that I seemed lighter. I didn't argue with her. We still talked every other week, sometimes more, sometimes less. Our relationship hadn't transformed dramatically, but it felt more honest. I no longer performed stability for her. I let silence exist when it showed up. At work, new hires came and went, leadership shifted. The people who had once seemed untouchable were now careful in ways they hadn't been before. Every so often, someone would ask me how I had handled that difficult period. I never knew quite how to answer. Handled wasn't the right word. I hadn't overcome anything. I hadn't outmaneuvered anyone. I had simply stopped making myself available as a solution to other people's problems. That distinction mattered more than any outcome. One evening, as I packed up to leave, I noticed something small that made me pause. The desk next to mine, the one that had been occupied briefly by someone brought in during the height of the inquiry, was empty again. The chair pushed in, the monitor dark. No announcement had been made about their departure. They were simply gone. I felt no satisfaction, just clarity. People move through systems the way water moves through channels. When the structure changes, the flow follows. It isn't personal. It just is. As spring turned into summer, the flag out front was replaced. The fabric had worn thin, edges frayed from months of exposure. The new one snapped sharply in the wind, bright and unblemished. I noticed it the same way I'd noticed the old one. Briefly, then I kept walking. On my last day before a long weekend, I cleaned out the remaining personal items from my desk. Not because I was leaving, but because I no longer wanted to anchor myself there. The framed photo went into my bag. The spare charger, too. When I reached the bottom drawer, I found the blue notebook. I flipped through it slowly. The early pages were dense with detail dates, quotes, questions written in tight handwriting. Toward the end, the entries thinned out, fewer notes, more space. I closed it and sat quietly for a moment. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel wronged. I felt complete. The experience hadn't given me a new identity. It had stripped away one I'd been carrying without question. I used to believe that being reasonable was a form of safety, that if I stayed calm, cooperative, and adaptable, I would be protected. What I understand now is that reasonableness is only safe when it's mutual. When it isn't, it becomes a resource others feel entitled to draw from indefinitely. Stopping that draw didn't require confrontation. It required refusal. Not refusal as rebellion, but refusal as boundary. I didn't burn bridges. I didn't expose anyone publicly. I didn't force a reckoning. I simply declined to continue absorbing weight that wasn't mine. And when I did that, the system adjusted. Not because it became moral, but because it became accurate. That's the part people often miss. Truth doesn't need to be dramatic to be effective. It doesn't need a hero. It doesn't even need to be spoken loudly. It only needs to stop being padded. As I left the building that evening, the parking lot was quiet, bathed in the soft light of early summer. I unlocked my car, set my bag on the passenger seat, and sat for a moment before turning the key. I thought about the version of myself who had signed that document in March, pen slipping slightly in her hand. She'd believed that doing the right thing would protect her. She hadn't been wrong. She'd just misunderstood what protection looked like. Protection wasn't being included. It was being clear. I started the engine and pulled out of the lot, merging into traffic without hesitation. There was nothing left to wait for. The story I'd been bracing myself to survive had already ended. What came after it wasn't louder or easier or more impressive. It was simply mine. And that, I realized, was the only ending that mattered.